All right, everyone. Well, it's a tradition in the Royal Navy and in the Center for Geopolitics that if we initially don't succeed, we try again and we get there in the end. I'm delighted to see everybody here for this event, which was rescheduled. But here we are. We think a lot at the Center for Geopolitics about different ordering systems, different ways of conducting foreign policy, and the role of different forms of power in creating and changing geopolitical realities, both in Europe and across the world. We think historically, we always have done, and thinking about British grand strategy has never been more important than it is today at a time when so much is in flux. And when, as the new national security strategy states, we're entering an age of transactionalism in which we have to think again about how Britain conceives of its strategic strengths and uses its national power. If we're looking back to the past to understand the history of grand strategy, there is no one better to learn from than Professor Andrew Lambert, the Professor of Naval History in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Whenever I'm introducing Andrew, I have to ask which of his books he would like me to highlight before we get started, because there's so many of them. The one that I've learned a huge amount before this was The British Way of War, Julian Corbett and the Battle for a National Strategy, which really set out some of the internal debates inside British thinking in World War I from the perspective of the great writer, historian and theorist Julian Corbett. His latest book, No More Napoleons, How Britain Managed Europe from Waterloo to World War I, is taking the world by storm. I hear rumors of a paperback edition, which is all terribly exciting. The way we're going to do this is that Andrew will give just a presentation on the core themes of the book. Then I've got a few questions I'm burning to ask him, and then we will open things up to audience Q&A. Please put any questions into the Q&A function, and then I will read them out to be answered. And without further ado, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hugo. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's an even greater pleasure to be able to talk to everybody, and hopefully everybody can see the slides as well. What I want to look at this evening is how Britain did several really important things towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars. We're all familiar with these conflicts. They involve a tremendous amount of battles on the continent of Europe between very large armies, and they are often studied as small masterpieces or indeed lessons learned exercises for army tactical and operational thinking. What I want to concentrate on is how British grand strategy is avoiding getting involved in too many of those battles and shaping a future which is going to be more suitable to Britain's interests. The first of those interests is, of course, the reality that the war has left Britain with a monumental national debt. It is facing extreme economic stress of the sort that even today we're not familiar with. The governing team, all effectively descendants and disciples of the ministries of Pitt the Younger, are concerned to do two things which American political scientists would call ordering, as in using the peace process to create an international order which should be stable, minimize risk of future conflict, and enable Britain to retire as a continental operator, to bring its army home, largely demobilize it, and use the funds that are saved by doing that to begin to address the problem of debt. The scale of that debt meant that it was really not until sometime in the 1890s that the debt begins to come under some kind of control. As a result, that compromises the way Britain thinks about security going forward for the rest of the century. The economists want to cut defense spending, the security experts want to increase defense spending, and there's a constant battle. Ordering is about establishing borders which are durable, ensuring that there are no points of friction in the post-war structures which will lead to a return to conflict. The whole point of the Vienna Congress is to create a European state system which is stable and in stability, peaceful, and therefore economic. So it's about using the moment and using the skills of your team to create something which will be beneficial going forward. As we know, Foreign Secretary Castlereagh is the key player in establishing this order at Vienna, and the order involves reviving France as soon as Napoleon's been removed, allying ourselves with the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians against France, just in case France tries to become Napoleonic again, but also aligning ourselves with the Austrians and the French against the Russians and the Prussians to save large parts of the state of Saxony. So the British are creating something which is going to allow them to balance Europe from offshore. And that, again, is a modern American political science concept, which applies better to Georgian Britain than it does to 20th century United States. There are some critical map adjustments to make. As you all know, shortly after the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, France took over and incorporated the territory we would now call Belgium, in those days the Austrian Netherlands, and occupied or dominated the Dutch Republic throughout this period. And this transformed France's strategic leverage against Britain. The deep water anchorage of the Scheldt and the naval base at Antwerp, which Napoleon had built, posed a serious threat to the British Isles. We're often told that Napoleon planned to invade from Boulogne, but anybody who knows anything about Boulogne knows that there is no possibility of assembling 100,000 men with their horses and equipment in Boulogne harbour and crossing the channel without being noticed. Indeed, if you assemble those ships, they would be outside the harbour and they would be wide open to being attacked at sea by the superior Royal Navy. It is only by operating in the Scheldt estuary, which can be secured against British forces, that the French could pose a strategic threat. So the headwaters of the Scheldt estuary is the lowest of those three estuaries that you can see on the map here. And that is where the port of Vlissingen, or Flushing in Old English, is to be found, which was the operational base for a large fleet that Napoleon was building. So removing the French from Belgium removed their only significant deep water base from which they could launch a major full-scale invasion of the United Kingdom. There was no other port in France that would have allowed them to do this. So the adjustment of the border is absolutely critical, and it will ensure that the fate of this territory is existential to British security right the way down to the outbreak of the First World War, which, as you know, was about the neutrality and independence of Belgium, a system which the British had created. So the British create this in 1815, and while they're doing so, their ambassador in Paris, the Duke of Wellington, is also charged with updating the defenses of Belgium against a French invasion. And it's in September 1814, as he's returning to Paris via Belgium, that he studies where the forts will have to be placed. And he also looks for battlefields in Belgium. The one he picks is one we're all familiar with, the rise at Waterloo, which he found in the notebooks of the Duke of Marlborough, who had approached that particular field in the same direction as Napoleon, coming up from the south, heading north. And Marlborough had the good sense to maneuver around the battlefield, pulling a right flank maneuver to remove the enemy from a very strong position without having to fight them. Napoleon didn't do that. So Wellington had marked his card for where the battle would be fought. He was preparing the defenses, and as ambassador in Paris, he was intimately involved in shaping the future and ends up signing the Congress of Vienna on behalf of the British government. So this melding of strategy, policy, and power is already in place. Wellington, of course, like Castlereagh, Anglo-Irish, junior minister in Pitt's government, but more famously, the Generalissimo in the Iberian Peninsula, where his main job was stopping the French using the Tagus as a naval base to attack British shipping. Congress of Vienna creates a system which survives for about 3 weeks, and then Napoleon comes back, and Wellington then has to do the very thing that he had hoped not to have to do. So here is the city of Antwerp, which is at the heart of this problem. Antwerp, massively fortified, late medieval city being rebuilt during the Napoleonic Wars by Napoleon, who had a shipyard on the north bank of the river and 2 very large dry docks, wet docks, on the right-hand side of this picture, where he stored his battle fleet over the winter. The British Army tried to capture the fortress in 1814, but failed. Not enough troops and not enough quality as well. But the British were in position to take it over when Napoleon abdicated for the first time. Napoleon went to Antwerp, or Anvers, in 1803, accompanied by the Empress, and launched a great naval project to build a fleet that could actually invade England. He went back some years later with another Empress in 1810 to witness the launch of a great battleship named after his victory at Friedland. And by 1809-10, he was assembling a significant battle fleet in this area. And it was only the outstanding achievement of the Walcheren campaign, which destroyed the dockyard at Vlissingen, that blocked the opportunity of using Antwerp and the Scheldt as an invasion base. So what we see is Napoleon using this newly gained part of France to create a level of threat. I don't think Napoleon ever intended to invade England. I think he intended to keep the British on the defensive, to ensure that their main military force was at home, waiting for this invasion, which would effectively paralyze their action on the continent of Europe, while Napoleon was dealing with the rest of the Europeans. The 1809 attack on Vlissingen, which destroyed the harbor and the naval base, was such a success that within months, the British Home Defense Army had been reduced by 50%, and all of the spare men had been sent to the Iberian Peninsula. So there's a swing from defensive to offensive strategy. And what the British are trying to do by ordering is to enable them to balance the European system from offshore, to ensure that in the event of another French outbreak, they will be able to assemble allies, send a strike force, and join in the pacification of the region. In 1814, the Brits are finally in the middle of Antwerp, and here we see a picture by the same artist as the 2 previous ones, a local Belgian artist who's quite happy to paint for everybody and is doubtless well paid. So the redcoats are in town now. This is really important. The British used the peace to link what had been the Austrian Netherlands with the Dutch Republic to create the new Kingdom of the United Netherlands. So that's what we call Holland and Belgium, under one king, Protestant king, whose son was about to marry the daughter of the Prince Regent. While that didn't happen, it does mean that the British have a critical interest here, and they are using modern and old-fashioned diplomatic means to secure it. Battle of Waterloo is fought exactly where Wellington anticipated, in exactly the way Wellington had anticipated fighting it. He pointed out the position on a map before the battle, and it was quite clear what the battle was about. At 9 o'clock on the morning of the day, he was sitting on his horse writing a message to the British governor of Antwerp, insisting that he open the water defenses, be ready for a flood of refugees, and under no circumstances should he surrender the position. He was defending Antwerp and the Scheldt. He was not defending Brussels. And of course, as soon as the battle had been won, Wellington moves quickly to re-establish the Bourbons, who are revived for a second time, to fine-tune the Vienna settlement to ensure France is even less of a threat. And then he goes home and begins to cut the British army. In 1830, while he's prime minister, the Belgians revolt against Dutch rule, and he sets up the process that leads to the Treaty of London in 1839 that establishes an independent, neutral, and treaty-guaranteed Belgium. So this is Wellington's project. It's completed by Palmerston, but it's very much Wellington's project. And he will spend the rest of his career trying to ensure that Britain has enough troops to repeat the Waterloo campaign in Britain, and that they can be released by having adequate levels of trained militia and reserves. In September 1852, within a week of his death, he is speaking in the House of Lords, securing the passage of a new militia bill, which creates a paid militia as a reserve for the frontline force. He dies less than a week, as I said, after that. The following summer is the first camp of exercise held in Britain since 1815. And the year after that, the strike force that he has released by creating that militia is detached to the Crimea to destroy a Russian naval base. This is Wellington's contribution to British strategy, reducing fixed garrisoning in places outside British interests, reducing expenditure, but focusing on what is absolutely necessary for an effective maritime strategy, that is the capture and destruction of hostile naval bases. He also relies on the Anglo-German link that was established at the Vienna Congress by bringing the Prussians onto the Rhine at Koblenz. This was why the Prussians were in a position to join Wellington quite so quickly on the battlefield at Waterloo, and it was anticipated that in the future, if the French did repeat that attack, the British and Prussians would link up somewhere near Waterloo and do the same thing over again. When the House of Lords was rebuilt, the two great murals are of the Battle of Trafalgar and the Battle of Waterloo, and between them they explain how Britain looks at Europe. Britain has to command the sea for economic and security reasons, and its intervention in Europe will be focused on places like Belgium, which pose a strategic threat that must be countered. So sea control is vital, having a striking force that can be detached to Europe and having alliance structures which ensure that the superior forces will be on the same side as Britain is all part of that legacy. This is Castlereagh, Lord Liverpool, who invariably gets forgotten, but as Prime Minister is chiefly responsible for this. Liverpool is what we might call a Brexiteer. He was very keen on getting out of Europe by 1813 and pressed ahead with that agenda. So Waterloo is the capstone of the Napoleonic Wars, but more importantly, it is a marker for how Britain will behave strategically going forward in the 19th century in certain circumstances. And as the slide suggests, those circumstances do recur in 1840. In 1840, we have a Liberal government. Wellington is out of office. He's in the House of Lords. The King of France, at the end of the Muhammad Ali crisis, which has been a great humiliation for France, declares that he will stage a revolution, cross the Rhine, and reopen grand-scale conflict in Europe. The following day, the new young King of Prussia awards command of the Prussian army to the Duke of Wellington. This is all in the diplomatic record, but because nothing happened, everybody's forgotten about it. This is hugely significant. Everybody in Europe knows this has been done. Wellington accepts, and despite his age, he is going to use his prestige and his experience to deal with this upsurge of radical French action. So there is something very solid at the bottom of all of this, an understanding by the British and the Prussians that this will have to be done in the future, and both are well positioned to conduct those operations. There is, of course, another threat to British security, which is Russia. And when the Tsar of Russia holds a review in Paris with 120,000 troops on the Champs-de-Mars, the British government immediately staged a large fleet review at Spithead. Wellington arrives just before it really gets going. And they invite the Tsar and the King of Prussia and Clemens Metternich, the Chancellor of Austria, to come and see what British power looks like. And it's on record that the seasick Tsar was so flustered by the size and scale of the demonstration that he was in a bad mood for the rest of his visit to England. On his way out, along with his continental allies, he was dropped off at Woolwich Dockyard to observe the launch of HMS Nelson, the world's biggest battleship. I think that impressed Alexander, and it certainly ensured that Russia was not a destabilizing element in the European system for some years to come. So the British, using diplomacy, display, all the classic tools, to try and order Europe into a position where they have to interfere as little as possible. The damage to Vlissingen and the attack on the Scheldt estuary prompted Napoleon to redouble work on the great artificial harbour at Cherbourg. And here he is with his second empress, watching a very small review of a very few ships as they start work on building what will be the world's largest artificial harbour in a position hardly 60 miles from Portsmouth. This is Napoleon desperately trying to put up a threat which will pin the British on the defensive permanently. It will become the litmus test of French attitudes towards Britain throughout the 19th century, as restored monarchies, a republic, another empire, and yet another republic will all leave their mark on this enormous project as it comes to a conclusion. British attitudes in this period are summed up brilliantly by J.M.W. Turner's grand picture, Dido Building Carthage. Painted in 1814, exhibited at the 1815 Royal Academy show, which was on all the way through the Napoleonic 100 Days. This is the picture of the show, and it's a classical allegory for the defeat of Napoleon. As you doubtless all know, Napoleon referred to the British as the Carthaginians, so Turner painted the Carthaginians and pointed out that the British had actually won the war. The central figure in the picture is Queen Dido, who is just to the left of center, but she is observing a group of small boys playing with paper boats, who are the future captains of a Carthaginian sea empire. So this is sea power defeating land power. It hangs in the National Gallery, as Turner fully intended, in exactly the place he specified. This is England winning the Napoleonic Wars in classical allegory. The problem that the British had immediately after the war was not what to do with the Navy, but where to start. Having defeated all comers in the Napoleonic Wars, there really wasn't a naval rival out there. But the Algerians were still pirating and enslaving European sailors, not British, but certainly Maltese and Italian. So the Royal Navy went and bombarded Algiers, destroyed the pirate fleet, and forced them to release all of their Christian slaves. They did this not necessarily for the obvious reasons, but to stop the Russians trying to do it, because they didn't want the Russian fleet in the Mediterranean. The operation is effective, but it's rather crude. In order to destroy the port, you have to get very close and take quite a lot of risks. The ship in the center, with its stern to you alongside the flames, is the Queen Charlotte, the flagship, and she is less than 100 yards from the battery, which is just destroying with close-range fire. Across the century, Britain will increase its capacity to deliver long-range precision fire to deal with threats like this. There will be a succession of harbors that get bombarded by the Royal Navy to prevent them being used as naval bases against Britain. The British have also established quite a record for doing this in the war against the United States, the War of 1812. And here we see British mortar vessels bombarding Fort McHenry at Baltimore. You're all familiar with the line, the bombs in the air, the rocket's red glare. That's the Royal Navy bombarding an American port stuffed full of privateer warships. In the 1830s, the Royal Navy establishes a gunnery school looking for longer range and more precision fire as cannon and mortars become more accurate through improved manufacturing. This man, Admiral Sir Thomas Hastings, is captain of the Excellent in the 1830s and early 40s as they're searching for longer range, faster fire, and more impressive missiles. Hastings had an advantage that many of his peers had not had. He had spent 3 days as the first lieutenant of the ship carrying Napoleon to his exile on Elba, where Napoleon revealed himself to be a fount of rather bombastic stories, but also quite revealing about his strategic and other ideas. It certainly influenced Hastings and the captain on that voyage. So Hastings is creating a corps of professional naval gunnery specialists, both officers and ratings. So by the time we get to the Crimean War, the Royal Navy has an outstanding cadre of very experienced, highly trained, scientific cannon operators. In 1840, during the Syrian crisis, or the Mehemet Ali crisis, an Anglo-Austrian Ottoman fleet bombards the Crusader castle at Acre, which is being defended by the Egyptians. And in a matter of an hour, they overwhelm the defenses, knock most of the guns off the walls, and eventually an exploding shell from one of the steam vessels sets off the main Egyptian magazine, at which point all resistance collapses. The speed of this attack reflects the increased firepower. These ships have heavier cannon, they are more accurately used, and most of the gunnery officers are professionally trained. It's overwhelming fire, it's highly effective, and casualties are minimal, unlike the attack on Algiers. Many of the gunners who served in this battle had been trained at HMS Excellent, and this was seen as a vindication of that project. We now need, I think, to turn to the reason why the British are so concerned about the state of Europe throughout this period. From 1814, when Napoleon abdicates, the Bourbons are restored, then the Bourbons are thrown out again by Napoleon. He is then removed, the Bourbons are re-restored. But in 1830, the Bourbons are overthrown, and we get the Orleans monarchy of Louis Philippe, the cousin of the last Bourbon king. This talks a lot to instability, and it's the problem that France faces in the post-Napoleonic era. French leaders are trying to find something around which the nation can unify without being overly concerned with the form of government. And increasingly, they double down on military glory. So in 1837, King Louis Philippe, the King of the French, not the King of France, important distinction, opens a vast gallery of battle pictures in the basement of Versailles. The Galerie des Batailles is based on his own personal project, but these are monumental canvases, some of them 12 meters wide, 3 or 4 meters high, which celebrate every French victory from Charlemagne defeating the Moors at Roncesvalles through to the latter stages of the Napoleonic Wars. There are, I hasten to add, no French defeats on display. Louis Philippe is using this as a tool to pull the country together behind a project, national glory. He's selling them something which he thinks they really want. But the lessons of the revolutions of 1830 and the one that got rid of Louis Philippe in 1848 is that unenfranchised working class Parisians were not interested in glory. They wanted bread and money and possibly a vote as well. But their concerns were not certainly with war and glory. Most Frenchmen didn't want to pay the tax that war exerted from them in their money and in many cases the lives of their sons. France was not a belligerent country, but its leaders postured as a belligerent country and got themselves into terrible trouble. Louis Philippe was backing Mehemet Ali against the Ottoman Sultan, so the Battle of Acre was a massive defeat for him, and that's when he threatens to upset the apple cart and cause a major European war. His bluster is blocked by the King of Prussia, as I said earlier, by summoning Wellington, to apply a little bit of logic to this. But this sense that France is dynamic, aggressive, and unstable is something that keeps Wellington and other British statesmen awake at night. It's not that they're worried that France will win, they're just worried that any war against France will be long and it will be expensive, and the economic cost of that will have significant political and social consequences. So avoiding another war is a big issue, and that means being able to deal with what the French are doing. There's a wonderful moment at the opening of this event. Louis Philippe is presenting his pictures to the assembled diplomatic corps, most of whom are old enough to have served in the Napoleonic era and are a little bit shocked to find their countries being publicly insulted by the French. This picture excited the derision of one British minister, the capture of the Bayonnaise of HMS Ambuscade. Napoleon commissioned the picture from Louis-Philippe Crepin, who's a great marine artist. It is a fabulous picture. But as the British general present, Sir Herbert Taylor, said, if we had a picture for every time we'd done that to the French, there wouldn't be walls enough in the country to hang them on. And this was an exceptional moment in French history, which Napoleon had chosen to celebrate. So this idea of glory is still hanging around. The French are still thinking about this. Their leaders are still trading in it. And nowhere more obviously than Napoleon's great picture of the Battle of Eylau, where he is posing as both the conquering hero and the redeemer. It's a picture of almost as big as you can get. It sits alongside the raft of the Medusa in the Louvre these days. Two very, very big pictures about truly dreadful things. Turner would quote the figure in the center below Napoleon's horse, a figure upside down, eyes closed, obviously stone dead. And that figure will be quoted in Turner's Trafalgar of 1824. He had seen this picture in the Louvre. So Napoleon chose this picture. It was painted to glorify him, and it now appears in Louis Philippe's collection, where it doesn't glorify Louis Philippe. And reviving Napoleon is not a good way to make relations peaceful with your European neighbors who can all remember what happened last time. Most of these pictures are still on the walls to this day, although I'm not sure how many people go to visit them. Captain Hastings was replaced as commander of the Excellent by Admiral Sir Henry Chads, and he begins work on the real punchline of British strategic thinking in the 19th century, which I tend to call the Cherbourg strategy for the sake of the want of any better title. Essentially, being able to use naval force to destroy hostile naval bases to prevent any threat at sea emerging is the purpose of this. Chad's work on the Excellent takes the bombardment technology into the age of rifled cannon and exploding shell. He too is a very experienced combat veteran from the Napoleonic era, and he knows exactly what he's doing. He will be mobilized into the fleet when the Navy goes to the Baltic to start attacking the Russians in 1854. He is the man standing with a flat hat just behind the cannon, watching professionally trained gun crews firing at a range of about 3,500 yards with an 8-inch gun. And you'll spot the two midshipmen just the other side of the gun who are looking out to measure the fall of shot. So we have 4 admirals watching a precision bombardment, and the Russian fort in question surrendered fairly quickly. The following year, gunboats and mortar vessels were sent, and the great fortress at Sveaborg, just outside Helsinki, was bombarded for about 50 hours continuously. The Russians didn't fire back because their guns wouldn't reach out as far as the fleet. There were no fatal casualties in this battle, so unlike other major events in the Crimean War, it was not much reported and largely ignored. The editor of the Times literally told the First Sea Lord that the butcher's bill was far too paltry for it to get anywhere near the headlines. Following this battle in August 1855, the Royal Navy doubled down on these coast assault technologies and was preparing to take down Kronstadt and to attack St. Petersburg in 1856, which may explain why the Russians surrendered after Sevastopol fell later in 1855. Sevastopol was captured by the Allied forces in the Crimea after a year-long siege. But everybody forgets that the whole purpose of the siege was to destroy the naval base. Sevastopol as a town is not hugely interesting, and the Crimea is of no interest at all to the British. Only Sevastopol, which is the naval base from which the Russian Navy can carry an army to capture Istanbul. So destroying the naval base is a strategic imperative. And here we see the Royal Engineers in the bottom of the dock, undermining the dry docks, which are essential to maintaining the fleet. And up on the high ground are a group of French officers who are watching the Englishmen spending an awful lot of time destroying a hole in the ground. But this is British strategy. Naval engineering and support resources have to be destroyed as soon as possible in order to prevent the enemy from using fleets effectively. The Black Sea is neutralized. The Russians don't have a fleet there for the next 20 odd years. And this means Britain doesn't have to worry about the safety of Istanbul, and crises with the Russians go away for the best part of 2 decades. So this is how the British see operations. It's modeled on the operation at the capture of Vlissingen in 1809. It was planned by officers who took part in that campaign or were trained by veteran officers from that campaign. The Crimean campaign is planned by a senior Royal Engineer officer. That's not accidental. The job of the engineers is to blow up the things that make British strategy difficult, and they succeed brilliantly here. The war ends with a peace in March 1856, and shortly afterwards a grand review is held of the fleet that was assembled to attack Kronstadt and St. Petersburg. It's on St. George's Day. It's a royal review. The Victoria and Albert steams down the lines as roughly 100 gunboats and other vessels conduct a mock bombardment of Southsea Castle. That is, they're firing a lot of powder but no shot. The British take all of the diplomatic corps from Westminster down to see this, apart from the Americans, who won't come because they know what the message is. This is in many ways the high watermark of Victorian naval power. This armada is designed specifically for attacking and destroying coast defenses and capturing and destroying naval bases. Within 60 miles of it, the French are coming close to finishing the work at Cherbourg, the purpose of which is to coerce the British into taking their side in a future conflict. In 1858, Victoria and Albert agree to go to a jamboree event at Cherbourg. They've actually already been in their private capacity and have had a good look round the place, with Victoria doing some useful sketching and the Royal Engineer officer who was in charge of bringing up her second son joining in. So the British go with a battle squadron. They send their most famous admiral, Admiral Lord Lyons at the time. A lot of parliamentarians go, quite a lot of unemployed naval officers attend. And it's a visit to an event where Louis Napoleon III, the ruler of France, is showing to the British his navy, his dockyard, and the sheer immensity of his project. What he's saying is, look upon my works and tremble. Why don't we have a deal and we'll agree how we're going to change Europe to make it better suit the way that we want it to be. The subtitle is, this is a French project. Albert, because in those days men had to do this business, has to explain to Louis Napoleon that the British don't do preemptive reconstructions of continental Europe. They're not really interested in that. They deal with events on a case-by-case basis, and that there was no possibility of the British joining an Anglo-French alliance to reorganize Europe to suit Louis Napoleon. That's the end of Napoleon's project, because his bluff has been called. The British are confident they can destroy Cherbourg. They have the assets, they have the base facilities, they have the engineering depots, the weapons, and they are not troubled by this. So instead of being browbeaten into joining France, they're able to go away and conduct their business as they wish. So here's a great French picture, Victoria and Albert about to board the French flagship, La Bretagne, the Brittany, and this is where the message was delivered that the British were not interested in an alliance. So there's a lot of smoke and splutter, but no serious action. Victoria and Albert and the Brits all went home then, and Napoleon then opened the high-speed rail link to Paris, which is obviously quite useful strategically, and commissioned a equestrian statue of Napoleon on horseback, Napoleon I, that is, pointing at Portsmouth. But that's about as close as the French ever got to invading England. They put a statue up. A decade later, the British went back to have a look at Cherbourg, and it was all rather run down and a bit sad. The flagship from 1858 was now a training hulk without any engines in it. And the British sent a couple of very powerful ironclad warships, which made the point that the British were still masters of the ocean. So what the British have done is not only establish a system, an ordered system, they've balanced it against various risks. And by the late 1860s, they can see clear blue water ahead, that there are no serious threats. The American Civil War has distracted the United States, Russia is weakened by the Crimea, and France is thrashing around looking for a future for its empire. And then in 1870-71, France will come down in ruins and stability will be preserved for some time. But in 1870, something happened. The British were acutely aware that the strategic odds in a Franco-Prussian war were that either side, both sides, would march through Belgium. So the British send out a very strong diplomatic message to Paris and Berlin and demand that they agree not to do this. And at the same time, they build some new battleships, not only to fight on the coast, but to support the fortress of Antwerp. 4 of these Cyclops-class ships would have completed the defense of Antwerp in the event of conflict. This was all overseen by Prime Minister Gladstone, a man not normally associated with strategic insight, but it's highly effective. The British ability to offshore balance persisted, and it would be used against Russia and France again later in the 19th century. To finish, we need to think about 1914, when France and Germany are squaring up again on the borders of Belgium, and Britain needs to say something strategically in order to preserve that treaty which the British had created and had upheld ever since. But instead, the British government waits until the borders of Belgium have actually been violated by the Germans, and then declares war against Germany, but does not send the strike force, British Expeditionary Force, which had been created following the strategic advice of Julian Corbett back in 1907. It was not sent to secure Antwerp, which would have prevented the Germans getting up onto the Belgian coast. It was sent to join the French fighting line in defending France. So we go to war over Belgium, but we don't go to war effectively to protect Belgium. The irony of this is that the Liberal government of 1914 included several men who had served under Gladstone and were aware of his career, including his authorized biographer. If you ever get out John Morley's enormous 3-volume biography of Gladstone, you will find all the information you need to understand how Gladstone used naval and military mobilization to deter aggression against Belgium in 1870. Even with John Morley in the cabinet, nobody reflects back on this experience. They plunge willfully into something which is the very thing that Wellington and his generation had worked so hard to ensure would never happen again. That is a full-scale continental war in Europe in which Britain was obliged to contribute a mass army. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. If you just hit stop share screen, then we can get into a discussion.
There we go.
Perfect. So I can already see some questions coming in, and I encourage people to type questions into the Q&A function. But just thinking through your talk and having read the book and greatly appreciated the book, maybe a couple of questions from me. Firstly, you describe very powerfully the strategic naval thinking strand of British foreign policy. There is also a constitutional liberal strand that comes out in support for Greek independence, support for constitutional liberals in Spain and Portugal, in half-hearted and ultimately unsuccessful efforts to both protect the Vienna settlement in Poland and support the restoration of Polish independence. And I was wondering how those two, if you like, those two sides of the coin of British foreign policy in this period.
Mm-hmm.
The very Tory, you could describe it as the Brexiteerism of Lord Liverpool, this very conservative idea of withdrawing from Europe, and what one might call the constitutional liberal commitment to supporting liberal nationalism on the continent. How did you find that they came together in researching your book, and were they in essence in contradiction?
All right. Thank you for that, Hugo. That's a really good question. It's important to think about some of the personnel here. Wellington is far more flexible than people think. He's prepared to think about using force, but he's much happier thinking about not using force. And he is the architect of this strategy. You know, I would call it a Wellington system. As the legatee of Liverpool, of Castlereagh, of Pitt the Younger, that's what he's carrying through. His military side is very much enabling Britain to do the things that need to be done. It's not military first, it's certainly political first. When the Treaty of London is finished in 1839, Foreign Secretary is Palmerston, former Tory minister, served under Pitt, who has moved across the floor of the House and become a liberal. And he is quite happy using fairly brusque methods to support Britain's vital interests. But what you see in both the Greek crisis and the Spanish liberal crisis in the early 1820s, the limits of British power. The British do not want to get involved in a civil war in Spain. Wellington doesn't want to, the government don't want to, and I have a suspicion that the Liberals, if they'd been able to get into office, wouldn't either. With the Belgian uprising, everybody is very keen that this does not become a major war. So we end up with the British agreeing that the French can remove the Dutch garrison from Antwerp, and Antwerp is the absolute pivot point of British interest in the continent, because they don't want to send an army, they send a navy. And the British persuade the Dutch to behave themselves by putting an economic blockade in and ruining their economy, which is classic British strategy. So they don't want to get involved in these if they can possibly avoid it. And when you get to the Greek crisis, what are Britain's vital interests? Well, protecting trade and protecting the Ionian Islands, trade in particular, because those are under the British Crown. They're looking for stability rather than liberal progress. And they're going to spend the next 20 odd years trying to get rid of the king they selected for Greece and replacing him with somebody slightly better. So what I think is going on is that Britain is trying to maintain peace, because peace is by far the best option for economically troubled countries. And they're trying to promote trade. And these two things come together with Palmerston. So we look at something like the Opium Wars, certainly the first Opium War, Palmerston's in charge. What are they doing? They're trying to increase the pace of trade. They're trying to increase revenue. So they're looking at ways of dealing with the costs. And there isn't another game in town, so they're having to play the maritime card. And as long as Europe doesn't become a major war zone again, this is going to start to work. But what you find is by the 1850s, savings have been made, they all get used in the Crimean War. By 1900, savings have been made and they all get burned up in the Boer War, and the British come out of the Boer War with a debt that they'd had 20 years before. And they are just beginning to get on top of the debt in 1913-14 again. It's starting to go down quite quickly. So no First World War, this would look very differently. And the tendency to leave Wellington out of this, to leave home defenses out of this, to leave out some of the big infrastructure projects. In order to maintain this position, Britain has to build two massive strategic harbours on the south coast of England, one at Dover and another one at Portland, because steam-powered warfare means that you need secure anchorages for your fleets at night, particularly merchant fleets. You have to upgrade your fixed defenses, and then steam power means you need a whole new set of equipment, particularly more dry docks, engineering facilities. So there's a constant churn of strategic risk technological progress, cost, and then you have French instability in particular, which means that you can never be entirely sure that the next 5 years will be peaceful. So it's about having a grand system which doesn't get unduly affected by the transfer of power from one political party to the other. That would have been catastrophic. So what we find is even if the domestic policies can be radically different, the external policies and the strategic policies tend to be much less contested. So I think there's a clear separation between the two. And there isn't, in that sense, a Tory or a liberal strategic policy. There's a British policy which they both basically adhere to. The Liberals see less use for the army. The Conservatives probably slightly more, but it's a question of balance there, not a question of absolutes.
I want to come back to that and come back to it in the context of a question we've received from Hayden Belfield in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
But before I do, reading No More Napoleons and reading it in light of your work on the War of 1812, I was struck by your sense, which runs through all your work, that British and American interests are fundamentally misaligned. And it goes to your regular invocation of Carthage and of Carthage, Britain as Carthage to these continental Roman states. And it's in this book, it's in so many of your works. There is another interpretation, which one might call the Harold Macmillan interpretation, which is that Britain is, if we're doing classical comparisons, Greece to America's Rome. That Britain is not in conflict, but is creating systems and processes of thought and economic models that are then going to emerge in some sense in cooperation with new ideas emerging in America. And that these are essentially culturally similar nations. We've seen such a powerful representation of the bond between the two nations this month with the new agreement on AI between Keir Starmer and President Trump. So is it only Carthage Rome, or is there some sense of cooperation that exists behind the clashes over naval strategy?
Yeah. There's a fundamental issue here, which I think is often obscured. When we look at the United States Navy and the Royal Navy, we tend to think these are just major naval forces and they do the same job. They absolutely do not. The Royal Navy is a maritime security force that also does warfighting. The United States Navy is a warfighting organization that doesn't do maritime security. The United States Navy has no legal authority to conduct operations at sea for a blockade, for example. American naval officers have no legal training. They're not expected to undertake anything that involves knowledge of international law. So America is a much more Roman state than Britain could ever be. Its scale and its raw power mean that it doesn't have to think about being agile. Being a sea power state is not a good thing. It's a confession of weakness. Britain was always a weak state, which maximized the advantage it got from asymmetric strength at sea and through the economic prosperity that generated. But I think Macmillan was making the best of what was a rather embarrassing period in British history. Remember, he came to power as a direct result of the Suez Crisis of 1956, a totemic humiliation, which isn't remembered often enough by those of us who think quite so well of the Anglo-American relationship. We are America's best friend until they have another best friend, or until we say something that they don't wish to hear. But that's the nature of international relations. Sentiment doesn't have much to do with it. So I tend to take the opposite view. I think these are two very different countries that have a mutual interest in dealing with far worse countries out there, which are doing far worse things to the international system and to their local region. It's obvious we have more in common with the Americans than we do with the Russians or contemporary China, etc. But that isn't the same as, I'll put it like this. You try explaining cricket to an American.
I think I'd find it easier than some other things in global geopolitics, but I understand the point.
Yes, very good.
All
Very
right.
good.
Let's go to some questions from the audience. Again, there's one I want to get to on the late 19th century.
Yep.
A question here from Nathan Watson. The most controversial view in your book, as he puts it, is that the Walcheren campaign was a success.
Mm.
How do you view that the key strategic objectives were met in that mission, since Antwerp was not taken and the dock was not destroyed?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. That is one of the classic questions. The planning papers for the Walcheren campaign are very clear. The destruction of Vlissingen is the primary object. The attack on Antwerp, which is just a shipyard, it's not a naval base. You can't operate a fleet without a base which has docking facilities, which they don't have at Antwerp. They have a wet dock there, but they don't have a dry dock. The dry dock is essential to the maintenance of the underwater body of large ships. So essentially, the operation is conducted as it should be conducted. They went for the primary objective straight away. It took rather longer to capture Vlissingen than they'd anticipated. It was quite well defended, but it was defended, it was taken, and it was then systematically and extremely thoroughly destroyed. Every last piece of stone in Vlissingen was smashed. Not just the dry dock, but all of the freshly cut stone that had been delivered there to build another one. So the Royal Engineers were breaking things which hadn't even been built into structures to make sure that nothing happened. The dock was not rebuilt before the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Antwerp was a major fortress. It would have been a very difficult target to attack. It would have ended up looking remarkably like the Sebastopol campaign, but the British didn't have enough troops of their own to do this. So what happens is the primary objective is achieved. The army comes home with about 4 fatal casualties from battle and several thousands from disease, which is not uncommon in this period. So no, the common understanding that it was primarily an attack on Antwerp is a mistake. The opportunity to attack Antwerp was there briefly. Had Walcheren fallen quickly, and the British been prepared to leave a force behind to destroy it, they could have pressed on up the river. But until they'd taken Walcheren, they had no business going to Antwerp. And destroying Antwerp would not have solved the problem. So it's Walcheren which is essential. And the trouble with the operation is that historically, it's always written up from a military point of view. And if you take the naval point of view, it solves the big conundrum. And it's only by reading it as a success that you can understand why they removed so many of the regular units from the UK in the following 18 months. So the war in Iberia gets a big shot in the arm because the threat of an invasion of the United Kingdom has been greatly reduced, if not completely removed. It's also worth stressing that Napoleon masses his troops around Boulogne and the Belgian border for all of his campaigns. In 1805, he marches the army from Boulogne all the way down to Ulm and Austerlitz, and they're assembling forces there in 1812 as well, and also in 1806 and 7. So this is the area where Napoleon assembles his armies. And he talks about the invasion of England so that he can persuade the Austrians he's not coming to attack them. And the Austrians, being slightly innocent, assume that he's actually telling the truth. So ultimately, it's about taking out the naval facilities. And that's the basis of the way the British see any great power conflict with Russia, with France, with the United States. It's a bit more difficult with Prussia and Austria, but then we don't anticipate fighting either of those because our interests don't clash. Russia and France and the United States are potential enemies. The other two, almost certainly not.
So we're in this moment of, as you say, cooperation on foreign policy between Whig and Tory and Conservative and Peelite and what will eventually be Liberal. Now, you know my views that where this fundamentally breaks down is over Schleswig-Holstein, but I want to talk about whether something else represents an alternative that breaks it down, which is new imperialism.
Mhm.
And in fact, throughout the 1960s, you have a conservative party voicing a complete alternative, not just to offshore balancing, but the idea that Britain needs to worry about Europe at all. And you have Israelis saying in elections that Britain is an Asian power, for example, and that idea that we must recommit to India in particular. By the time we get to 1914, and in this book, as in so many of your books, the conservative generals of 1914 get a right meaty kicking. The reason they exist is that they are needed to govern a continental colonial empire, whether in Africa or in India. So you talk about why the mistakes are made in 1914, why we enter war for defense of Belgium and end up in France by mistake, as if we sort of got the wrong boat. Is the explanation the new imperialism? Is the explanation that turn towards continental government?
I tend not to think this, because the army is not expanding. We have an army which is just about big enough to support relatively low levels of colonial defense. It takes Wellington 30 odd years to get a decent militia established so that he can release the regulars from the United Kingdom. In the Crimean War, the militia units are deployed in Britain and across the Mediterranean garrisons to release regulars for frontline service. In the Boer War, all the garrisons that can be reached are staffed by militia. Under their contract, militiamen are not obliged to serve in frontline roles, but they can be deployed in support roles, including garrisoning in peaceful areas. They can also be encouraged to volunteer, but they don't always do that. So if Britain is going to be a continental power, it needs to start mobilizing continental military resources long before 1916. There's an inherent objection in British politics to conscripting men into the army, so it doesn't start until 1916. Everybody else in Europe has been doing it for centuries. Britain is standing alone in that sense because that's the best option. Why is the army in South Africa? Well, there are resources there. There is wealth there. That's where the money comes from. Same with India. The British are not governing India because it's a nice thing to do. They're governing it because that's hugely profitable. So having a security force to protect your profits, which are keeping your empire stable, is important. But the British would also have to be involved right the way around the world because of their global maritime economic engagement. So Britain is dominating global shipping. It's also very prosperous, and it's building up a very large portfolio of overseas investments. And those need to be secured. And you can't do that with an army if they're in Argentina. Before the First World War, Britain owns Argentina effectively. It's capitalized Argentina and several other countries. So there's formal empire, there's also informal empire, and you have to put them all together. You mentioned Julian Corbett. His family fortune, which was made by his father, is invested globally. He has a portfolio which looks remarkably modern. American industrial, foreign railway systems. He's profiting from the global nature of British power. And Britain has the power to ensure that those investments are not sequestered, stolen, or interfered with by foreign governments. So the Navy is a security system for your ocean-going shipping, but also for your overseas investments. Go back to early 1850-51 in Greece, where the British fleet seized the Greek Navy and merchant ships in the harbor of Athens until the Greeks had paid a debt to a British debt holder. So it's a global enforcement system for a global economic operation. And that's why it's significantly different to all the other European powers. And the first country to come along that's really challenging that is the United States in the late 19th century, when it starts to create informal empire in the Western Hemisphere.
It's interesting. I mean, inherent to that is a refutation of the old Hobson thesis that about the profitability of empire. I want to get to Hayden Bellfield's question now because it comes right to this, which is how you engage with the weary Titan Friedberg thesis.
Yep.
And whether the key decade is the 1890s and the failure to do, as Belfer puts it in his question, the things needed to preserve advantage. And he cites industrial strategy, tax increases limited to conscription, and naval expansion. I think you'll have some views about which of those lists would actually be necessary and in what context. But that central question, how does your thesis sit with the weary Titan idea?
We have to remember the context in which Chamberlain is speaking. He's trying to create a wholly new kind of empire. He's going to create an empire which is bound together by tariffs, which have become quite topical this last year or so. He's trying to rebuild the British Empire as an empire of continental scale connected by the sea. And you'll find some of this in several people writing at this time. Julian Corbett takes a rather different view, and as a progressive liberal, his argument is that the empire will, over time, continue to do what it was doing from the 1850s onwards, which is to morph into a self-governing system of commonwealths, each of which would be connected to Britain by mutual interest, by a shared culture, by economic activity, and ultimately by the critical reliance that all of these states, new and old, would have in maintaining command of the sea. As he put it in a lecture he gave at King's College London in 1917, this sea commonwealth would enable the various components of the British Empire, as they reached the point where they were ready for representative government, to carve out their own space in a world alongside the other elements of the former empire. And that this would be represented by a global naval force, which was owned by Britain and all of its components. If you look at what's happening in Australia around the consolidation of Australian home rule, the creation of a navy. Canada doesn't do this because it doesn't see that as essentially necessary. But in 1907, Corbett and Halford Mackinder are sent to the Tercentenary of Quebec to interrogate leading Canadian opinion formers on whether Canada is going to produce a large military resource, whether it's going to produce an effective navy. Corbett's mission is quite short. It's quite clear Canada isn't going to do this. Mackinder's mission is rather longer because it's quite clear that Canada probably will be able to form a major army. But they're using the tools which are increasingly holding the empire together to shape that discussion. The Tercentenary is visited by George, Prince of Wales, later George V. He arrives on board the first dreadnought capital ship to leave the British Isles. That's HMS Inflexible. HMS Indomitable, first of the battle cruisers, and he crosses the North Atlantic at an average speed of 25 knots, which is unprecedented for a warship. And on the journey back, the ship is in continuous radio contact with London. A global radio possibility means that you can now think of strategically operating globally. You won't be waiting for the news from the other side of the world. You will have it very quickly. And it's that system which is used in December 1914 to crush the last elements of German naval power outside Europe. So the British are building the ships and the systems, and they're taking on board the technology faster than all of their competitors in order to maintain an edge that gives them sea control, because that's going to be the basis of their effort. What also becomes very obvious in 1914 is the very large amount of military age manpower, which is accessible in Australia, New Zealand, Canada. We have to remember that most of those volunteers in those countries were actually British. They were British born and had emigrated. And this explains the different dynamics, certainly in part, of volunteering in the Second World War, because most of the people who were eligible to volunteer in 1939-40 were locally born. They were Australians and Canadians rather than British-born emigrants who'd become Canadians and Australians. So there is another way forward. It doesn't involve a formal empire, and it doesn't involve tariffs because Corbett, like all good liberals, is not in favor of tariffs. And he believed that this was a much better option. He and Mackinder, of course, disagree very clearly on this. Mackinder is a chief speechwriter and cheerleader for Joe Chamberlain's approach. And of course, Chamberlain's defeated. Who defeats Chamberlain? The City of London. Who pays for the sea power state and the global empire? City of London. Where does the money come from? Global trade. So once you've got global trade and the profits of it as the center of your worldview, it becomes, I think, fairly obvious that putting tariffs on things is not going to happen. Chamberlain is trying to protect industrial production in Britain, but then he's a Birmingham industrialist. He didn't grow up in a seaport town. He's not familiar with these instruments. He has a different view to most of his contemporaries. The argument with Balfour is an argument between a little Englander and somebody with a global perspective who does understand strategy and has read Corbett's work and is very familiar with what he says and has no trouble implementing it when the time comes. So it's about having an understanding of just how different it is to operate in the position that Britain is in the long 19th century and its peer competitors. None of them are in anything like the same position. The Americans have some similarities, but they're so far away from Europe that Europe can't hurt them. The only country that could hurt America in the early 20th century is Britain, which explains a lot of American policy and a lot of American attempts to persuade the British not to blockade Germany in the First World War. So there's a system there which works if you can maintain control of the global ocean. Only one country has the information and resources to do that. In two world wars, the global convoy system is run by the City of London, seconded to the Admiralty. Without that, the liberal forces lose both world wars.
All right, I want to come to a question from Niles Webb now, which is on a corner of the globe that features a lot in Royal Navy military expeditions at this time, which is the Eastern Mediterranean. And he asks, how did the Eastern Mediterranean figure in British strategic thought? Was Disraeli influenced by the strategic thinking you've described during the Eastern crisis, or was it just about him having a grand adventure in foreign affairs? I mean, that's a very well put question. So over to you.
Yeah. The Eastern Mediterranean is critical because we have just outside the Eastern Mediterranean one of Britain's main peer competitors, Russia. The Russian drive to the Mediterranean is well known. It has very long history. They were trying to do this in the 8th century AD. It's always been blocked by somebody, and for the last 250 odd years, that's been Britain, because that would hugely complicate the regional system. But more importantly, Ottoman Turkey was Britain's major regional customer. And the trade with Turkey was a very big and very profitable enterprise. So when Muhammad Ali tried to overthrow the Sultan in 1840, the British were always going to back the Sultan. It's money. We have two Eastern Muslim potentates who are fighting over some territory. The British couldn't care less. They're fighting over the trade. And the Ottoman trade is worth a lot more than the Egyptian trade. So they're going to back the Ottomans. And they send a naval detachment to help the Ottomans mobilize their fleet. And then they defeat Muhammad Ali as well. When the Russians invade the Danubian principalities, modern Romania, in 1853, they are threatening to collapse, destabilize, remove the Ottoman Empire. And that will be a massive threat to Britain, because if the Russians take over, they close down economic access. Britain's objection to the Russian Empire isn't that it's an empire, it's that it's an exclusive empire, so that there is no economic opportunity within the Russian Empire. Russians get to Istanbul, a very large, very profitable market is lost. That's what they're fighting for. Palmerston says this over and over again. He couldn't be more explicit. This is about the money. This is trade. This is not about sentiment. We don't have a great sentiment for the Ottomans. We have a great admiration for the opportunities that working with them give us. So Eastern Mediterranean changes with the Suez Canal. Why does Disraeli buy the canal shares? Well, Britain is a primary user of the Suez Canal. It shortens the strategic route and the commercial route out to South Asia, to East Asia, and of course to Australasia. It joins up the British Empire and speeds up communications. These are all the things that British strategists have been trying to do for centuries, getting there quicker, moving intelligence faster. This is why they were so keen on Marconi. He promised you instantaneous. And immediately the Royal Navy buys this stuff and they're using it because this is the way ahead. And radio is going to be key in the war, along with your strategic communications. So you're building a global network which enables you to move information, and the information enables you to operate more effectively. And that's, when people talk about the British losing their technological edge, they certainly hadn't done that before the end of the First World War. It's not clear that they had by the end of the Second. By the time Harold Macmillan is whining about things, they possibly had, but then the money had run out. Yeah. Remember how this story ends. The British end up on the winning side of a major world war, and they've spent so much money. There is no possibility in any possible future in which they can carry on being a great power. It's over. The empire is gone. The other imperial powers keep their empires. Russia, China, the United States, they all keep hold of their empires because they're contiguous land empires rather than global maritime empires. So there's a different set of rules in play here. Not suggesting the empire should have been preserved, but it does work differently. If you can call something your country rather than having to refer to it as overseas. So we again come up with this issue. What kind of empire are we talking about? Can you walk from one end of it to the other, or do you have to get on a ship?
That gets us to if people have further questions, we're running out of time, so please do put them in the Q&A function now. But that gets to something fundamental to your work, and it came up both in that answer and particularly in your answer on the Weary Titan point, which is your fundamental belief that the roots of British economic strength lie in commerce, almost to the exclusion of manufacturing.
No, I think what I'm saying is the fundamentals have to be commercial. The technology side means that Britain is not only the world's biggest operator of ships, it's the biggest manufacturer of ships. So down to the end of the First World War, the biggest output of ships year on year is in Britain, all the way through the 19th century and well into the 20th. It recovers to that primacy, if not quite on the same scale, by the late interwar period, and then it is dwarfed by the effort the Americans put in. But that effort disappears. The Americans build a lot of ships in the Second World War, and then they stop. They don't build merchant ships, they don't own merchant ships, and their navy doesn't protect merchant ships. They're different. So no, the technology is critical, but the technology tends to focus on the things that enable your particular strategic interests. So the superpowers of the 21st century are able to play with all of the toys across all domains. Britain always had to focus on the sea and the relevant technologies. And the early Industrial Revolution moment could never be sustained given the relative paucity of human resources, let alone others, in the United Kingdom. So inventing the train, the steamboat, and all of that, great, but you're never going to be able to carry it forward at that scale because the country isn't big enough. So you're going to have to find ways of profiting from those skills. So back to Argentina. Who owns all the meat packing plants in Argentina? Oh, the British. Who built the railways? Oh, the British. Who runs all the ships to Buenos Aires and back? Oh, that'd be the British too. How useful is corned beef in a tin in the First World War? Very useful. Yeah. So it's about choosing where you apply. It's not having the luxury of these truly continental superpowers of the 21st century being able to move on all fronts. You have to prioritize. And my concern is that we haven't necessarily in the recent past focused as clearly as we might on the things that are most important. We've chased things which other people are chasing when we should have been pursuing our own primary interests. We've allowed the sea to drift out of time and mind, and as a result, most people in this country don't give a second thought to it, unless their feet are in it. Yeah.
On which striking point, and I think entirely correct point, we will draw this to a close. Andrew, thank you so much for your time this evening. I've learned a huge amount. I'm sure everyone watching and listening has too. Please stay tuned. These are themes and subjects we will absolutely return to as the Centre over the coming weeks and months. So all that is left to say, Andrew, is thank you so much indeed.
No, thank you very much, Hugo. Great chairman. Great chairman.